Competition, controversy, crashes. This is why Formula One needs a tyre war. I'm Peter Brook, I'm joined by Ciaron Smith and Nedzo's F1 Gridbox, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. So, for a lot of modern F1 fans, the concept of a tyre war is quite alien to them, because ever since 2007, we've had only a single tyre supplier in Formula One, first Bridgestone and then Pirelli. But for most of Formula One history, it was common to have two or more tyre suppliers for different teams, and they would build compounds that some would be good for long stints, some would be better for qualifying, some would be good in the wet, some would be good in the dry. And considering that the Pirelli tyres are not everyone's biggest fan, the three of us generally agree that we should go back to having a tyre war with two or more suppliers.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and I have to agree with you there that for most of F1's history, we have had a tyre war, and most of those seasons have been characterized by just a season-long battle between the tire manufacturers and pushing the level of performance between both tire manufacturers to new heights as the season goes on. That's another level of interest in the sport and in the season. So I personally think that a tire war is good for Formula One. I'm happy to delve into that further, but I'm sure yourself and Nedzo may have different thoughts on that.
I'm going to actually go against the crowd here. You said that we all agree that there should be a tyre war. I think there's more interesting variables that could be switched up to make F1 more exciting, but we'll get into that in due course.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, if we think about why a tyre war is interesting, I think we have to look at fundamentally what makes F1 interesting, and that's unpredictability. And I think that the reports of tires solely dictating performance in the tyre war are largely overblown. If you go back and look at the history of Formula One, so F1 started in 1950, we are now in 2025. If you look at that time period, it's absolutely remarkable, guys, to think that from 1950 to 1990, just under half a century, we had Dunlop, Continental, Firestone, Goodyear, Avon, Engelbert, Pirelli, and Michelin all going at it in competition. Then we know that there were a few years that there was just a sole tire supplier. For the mid-90s, there was a sole tire supplier for a little bit. But then in 97, we had a tire war with Bridgestone and Goodyear. And then in 2001 to 2006 with Michelin and Bridgestone. So honestly, for most of F1's history, in most of the classic seasons, there's been a tire war. This is not a modern phenomena, and I think the discussion now is just far too predicated on, oh, well, from 2001 and 2006, everything was about tires, and that's why we should not go back to a tire war, because it would be boring like the Schumacher years, and it would be bad for the sport. Well, that is not true. History shows us something different. And I would argue we've had some of the most predictable racing since the tire war ended. And fundamentally speaking, that's because a tire war actually always keeps us guessing. It's what I miss, that every weekend we would guess which of the tire manufacturers would have an edge going into the weekend. So that's just high level. We can jump into it a little bit more. I'm not sure what you guys think about that. I mean, to me, the tire war has been an integral part of F1. It's not some modern phenomena as so incorrectly reported at times, I think, both among the fandom and in the media.
I mean, I do agree with your point about ambiguity and how not knowing what's going to happen before a race weekend can help with that. But I believe there are more pertinent ways to drive up the unpredictability of Formula One. For example, if I became FIA president, God forbid, I would institute one 30-minute practice session that everyone gets at the start of a weekend and nothing else, so that you can't fiddle around with your setups and do we do 0.05 degrees of toe on the front tires, or do we do 0.01, like that sort of stuff. Like, you have to have a good car, I get it, and it has to be able to be going. And then the thing is with tires, I believe that considering the modern nature of competition, first of all, the field spread is extremely close. So you'd first of all need two tyres that were very close together, even if they had different characteristics. One was good for long runs, then fair enough, and one was good for short runs, then fair enough. But if there were two tyres that, for example, had a half a second time deficit on the short run and half a second on the long run, then it would be a nightmare because there'd be so much more field spread. But if they could find in a hypothetical world two tyres that had similar, like a tenth or two difference on each stint and stuff, that could work. But I also think that people would just find out which tire is better, like if it was better to trade off short runs and long runs, and then just they all pick the same tire in the end. Because I think Formula One is a lot more competitive than it was even 10, 20 years ago in terms of field spread. Like back in the day, you have Minardi 5-6 seconds off the pace. Nowadays, even the Haasers and the Alpines and the Williams that we joke about, they are 1, maybe 2 seconds off at some circuits. And tires, if they do make tenths of a second difference, people are just going to pick the quickest ones, regardless of handling characteristics. And obviously, some cars will handle better on certain tires, but they'll always pick the fastest ones.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. Ultimately, if you think about how the teams really operate, I don't think that bringing in a tire war would necessarily pose all those problems. I know people talk about, for example, like the cost cap and how a tire war runs up costs, how when Formula One was sold to a private equity firm in 2006, the first thing that happened was the tire war ended and costs came down, and that in addition, in an era where there's just so much regulation, it wouldn't make sense. But it just goes back to the spirit of racing. Racing is about pushing the limit, and that's what a tire war does. It pushes the limit of the teams, the sport, technology. The best tires are produced in a tire war, and that really does come down to finance and economics, right? Competition and product quality. The more competition you have, higher quality your product usually becomes. So I don't see why the teams and the tires wouldn't be able to adapt to a cost cap environment, and I don't understand, why people think in an era where testing is limited that some team might have a huge advantage with the tires. I don't think that would be the case. Just as you mentioned how there was a field spread back in the day, there's less of a field spread now, and there's much more regulation, and it's harder to get away with mass cheating in the way that you could. There's also no rampant testing rules that favor one team. I mean, part of the reason Ferrari dominated the tire war wasn't because there was a tire war, it was because they could go back to Maranello every weekend and just test at Fiorano, and the others couldn't. It was a huge part of it. So it wasn't just because of a tire war. And I think it's fully compatible and very efficient now, because it would ensure we don't have a weak product. It would ensure we have excitement. It would be within the cost cap. We could make it work within the cost cap regulations. So I don't see why, unless Pirelli is scared to go up against another manufacturer, I don't see why we're making excuses for why it shouldn't happen. Everything to me suggests that it should.
I will agree with your point about the modern day tires being lackluster. For example, I think Peter always bangs on about the at Monaco, was it last year or the year before, George Russell doing 75 laps on a set of medium tires. That should never be possible. I think that because of the 2012, 2013 spec Pirellis, where they would just like cheese and they would just go like they would be good for like 10, 15 laps, and then they just fall off a cliff. I think they're scared to go back to anything like that, so they always make the tires harder, or they just make it so they don't have the same fall off they used to. I think that if they made tires, and if they were forced to make tires that would do like 2 or 3 stops, so like a 2 or a 3 stop would be the best option, or in between 2 strategies, whether it be between a 1 and a 2, or a 2 and a 3, or even a 3 and a 4. I think that would provide good racing, because it's all about variability. It's all about like a fuel kind of introduced in refueling again would kind of stem the flow as well. But it's about if it's done right, because if you make it so that fuel in some way doesn't make it more interesting. It's just an added variable that doesn't actually do anything. That's the problem. But when it comes to tires, it doesn't really matter who makes the tires or how many people make the tires. If it produces good racing, I think that it should be very good. I think that obviously if you bring in 2 tire suppliers and then you say we still want tires to go 2-3 stops, 3-4, that's when it's going to become tricky, because if you're going to try and, as I say, drive up how good the tires are, they're then going to go, well, no, we don't want to make tires that are bad, because there's no point being in a tire war then. So I think unless you're going to go unless the FIA are going to institute regulations saying it still has to be interesting racing with tires that still degrade at a certain rate, I don't know how they'd measure that, then it could work. But I think that's also part of the problem, because modern day Formula One is not necessarily decided by the time, not necessarily like it was 10, 15 years ago, but it does play a big part in strategy and stuff. So if it goes to boring 1 stops like we had in the early 2010s, like with the last year of Bridgestones, or if we go to crazy 3, 4, 5 stop strategy like we had in 2013 and the early part of 2013, we need to find a balance, because 1 stops are boring and 5 stops are just insane, and people get punctures and it's just unfair on everyone. So it's finding a balance, and whether a tyre war would support that balance, I don't know, but I don't think it would.
So I started watching Formula One in 2007, so right after the tyre war ended. So all I've really known is a Formula One with only a single tyre supplier. So Bridgestone in those early years, at the time, the tyres worked reasonably well, but the rate in terms of the racing and strategy, it was less about tyre management and more about fuel, because we still had refueling at the time, so the tyres didn't play so much of a role. And then we saw the issue with the Bridgestone designs in 2010 when they got rid of refueling and they had slicks, and we could see that they can actually quite easily make them last for an entire race if they want, and they're only pitting at the first or last lap because it's mandatory. The Pirelli tyres, though, we've gone from having them originally being absolutely awful and just undrivable, and then at times being too good as well in recent years to try and counter that. Although the thing is, even in races where they do last a long time, such as we mentioned last year with George doing 75 lap stint on mediums at Monaco, which is helped by the fact that Monaco is a low speed circuit and is quite low on tyre wear in general, is that these tyres, you can make them last if you don't push them. Like, you need to really nurse them in and then just not push, because they know that if we've got basically 2 laps in them in a stint to have a go at the person in front of us, and if that doesn't work, we've used the battery up, the tyres are just going to die, so then we have to go back and start conserving the whole time. Whereas back in the tyre war era 25 years ago, you could push a lot, and this is something that drivers from this generation complain about, as they feel they had to push much harder and it was more physical for them, also because the cars were harder to drive than with these modern ones. But the issue back then was because they were grooved, and that was something that everybody hated because it took away so much grip. That was what killed that, really. But you still had that balance between Bridgestone and Michelin of grip versus durability and comparisons between the wet and the dry. And so what I kind of want to see is to get back to a point where you can make tyres last, but still be able to push them for long periods of time, rather than you get 2 laps in it and then you have to spend the rest of it tyre saving, because that's not really racing. And to have a second tyre supplier, or even treat it where, like engines, where teams can make their own tyres if they want, that would then throw in some quite interesting variables, because they could prioritize quali pace over durability. They could think, well, if there's going to be wet races, we need something that's going to be absolutely baller in the wet or something. And it just make it more variable, because yes, the field spread is close and it's making the things competition-wise close, which is not. It's less to do with the tyres. It's more to do with the extremely restrictive technical regulations, because we had different tyres back in the day. And yes, Minardi would have been 5 seconds slower, but that was because the car design was fundamentally very different from Ferrari's, because there was more open regulations and more freedom of what you could do. So I need that I don't like it being a spec series and being very close to a spec series. So I just want that sort of variability thrown in.
Point about teams making their own tyres works tyres in a way. I think the only way that would work is, obviously, there's a cost cap in place, so they wouldn't spend 10, 15 million on making new tyres. They'd have to get some sort of partner like they have with engines. So Red Bull have had Honda in the past, and they might go with Bridgestone, and then McLaren becomes the Michelin team, and then Ferrari becomes the Pirelli team because they're Italian. That could work, but I think that it would be a bit too far fetched, to be honest. I do agree with your point about how 20, 25 years ago strategies varied, and Schumacher was famous for he'd go on a 3-stop strategy and do 20 qualifying laps in a row, then 20 qualifying laps in a row, then 20 qualifying laps in a row, and he'd just do that. And that does produce, if you've got, for example, a guy like Verstappen doing 20 qualifying laps in a row and Norris having to save his tyres because he's on tyres that aren't as good, then that could produce some interesting racing. And obviously, it's another variable. It's just whether that would actually, because whenever we put these ideas through, like refueling, like with tyres, we always take the pros and never really look at the cons, because as much as I said, it could turn into someone's doing a qualifying lap stint and they do 3 stops, but they eventually end up really close, and the guy on a 1 stop ends up being close as well. We always act like that's going to always happen, where they're always going to be close, but it might be like a 10 or a 5-second difference, so it's really anticlimactic. So it's about whether that would actually come to fruition. I think that's a problem, because we can say all these things about a tyre war, but if the things that did make the tyre wars so good back in the day, whether it be increased competition and the rivalry between like McLaren and Ferrari, or Ferrari and every other team when they were on Bridgestones, and no one apart from the back markers was on the same tyres as them. It just depends whether that would actually work, because as I said, we've had many tries to make Formula One more exciting. We had fuel refueling being removed. We have had these more restrictive regulations, which although yes, they do restrict engineers, and engineers don't like it, it has produced closer, if not better, racing because of DRS, and it makes it too close and it makes it too easy to overtake and sort of stuff like that. But would tire wars just add another variable that doesn't actually do anything? We've had several regulations brought in to do other things, like, for example, the wide body regulations were brought in to make the cars faster without any consideration for any of the negatives. Would this be another situation where we haven't considered the negatives? Ground effect cars can't go over curbs, and they can produce problems, and they have like with the DRS and stuff, it's made it too easy to overtake at some tracks, and it's just boring watching people fly past each other under DRS. And DRS trains are a problem. DRS was brought in to increase overtaking, and when all it does is the guy second in the train can overtake, but the guy 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th in the train cannot overtake, and that makes places like Monaco utterly boring. Well, that's because of other reasons, because of the Monaco it's a track that's still relevant to Formula One, but the cars aren't. But aside from that, Ransom, would tyre wars actually bring all the pros without any of the cons, or would the cons prevail more than the pros?
Just quickly, can we pause momentarily? Because Ciaron, can you switch your camera on and off again? Because it froze for 10 minutes, and now all I see is a loading screen. Right, that's better. What was the question again? And then Ciaron, can answer it. And
pros and cons of tyre wars.
Yeah. So that's a really good point, Nedzo, and Peter's point earlier on as well about basically not becoming a spec series. But then also your point about how do you manage this tyre war? Because you're right, in the most recent iteration of the tyre war, there was basically a lot of things. There was basically sometimes a monopoly, right? I mean, one of the big criticisms was that Ferrari had a monopoly over Bridgestone tire development. So it wasn't really a tire war. It was like Ferrari versus Michelin. And people used to say, well, this is ridiculous because Jordan and Minardi are just proxies for Ferrari, and everybody else, Sauber is just like a servant team for Ferrari. And basically Ferrari get the benefits of all the development, while Michelin has to spread out across like 8 different teams. That's what people were complaining about, that Ferrari was getting a really unfair advantage. And the way to mitigate that, I think, is to mandate that a tire supplier would not be allowed to supply more than a certain number of teams on the grid. So Michelin wouldn't be able to supply like that many, and Bridgestone perhaps would have to supply at least a certain amount, and there would be regulations to ensure that nobody abused, or that Bridgestone or Michelin or Pirelli or whoever it may be wouldn't favor a team. So it does need to be tweaked, because otherwise, yes, you could get a situation where one team is being favored or there's abuse with the system. In terms of, how do you stop people from just going 50 laps on one set of tires? How do you stop people from doing 10 pit stops or whatever it may be? Well, I think that's where you have to mandate the use of different tire compounds themselves. And once you do that, I don't think anybody's going to even bother building a tire that can last the entire Grand Prix. If you have 2 or 3 compounds that you're mandating in a tire war, why would somebody try and do the entire race on one tire? That would very rarely work. Although at the same time, if somebody did that, I wouldn't have a problem with it because it's just more unpredictability. It's just another layer of interest in a sport that, as Peter mentioned, is in danger at times of breaching into spec series territory. We're not there yet. Sometimes I wonder if that's where we're headed.
It also,
So,
oh,
yeah, go ahead, Nedzo.
it also depends on how you regulate it between weekends, for example. Because what you could do is have one team, let's say at Monaco, and let's say every team has to have a soft, medium, and a hard, or every supplier has to have a soft, medium, and hard. So what one supplier does is they say, "Oh, let's come up with an idea where the softest tire does only one lap, and then the hardest tire can do the entire race." So at Monaco, they can have the softest tire in the world that is so much better than everyone else, and they can get on pole position. And then they just bolt on the hard tire, which goes the entire race, and they don't have to make a single pit stop. And then they just sit in front of everyone and go 5 seconds slower than everyone else.
You see, though, Nedzo, the thing is that is more likely when there isn't a tire war than when there is. And the reason is this. In the most recent tire war, every team had a dedicated representative. And this is something that we don't understand, that back then, there was like armies of Michelin or Bridgestone engineers dedicated to each team who would then report back to the main team or main tire supplier about not just what that team wants from the tire, but what the drivers want. They would have these tests where 20, 30 different compounds were brought, and the teams could pick exactly what they wanted. You know, the Michelin tire that Fernando Alonso and Renault were running was actually very different to the Michelin tire in many ways that Kimi and McLaren or Montoya and Williams were running. They were different. They were tweaked so that they would favor each driver a little differently, favor the car differently. And I feel like when you have that level of detail and ability to customize, you're not going to get any kind of oddball strategy, because ultimately I don't think the teams would want a tire that barely lasts. And then you have to ask yourself what the benefit of building some kind of world-defying, science-defining product that can last 50 laps while being pushed really is, if everyone else is being mandated to use, if you're being mandated to use 3 compounds. What's the benefit of even developing a tire that can last 50 laps? Because you have to take it off at some point anyways.
Yeah.
So to me, that's not as big a threat in a tire war. That's a threat when there isn't a tire war. And that's why I actually think a tire war with proper regulation can actually mitigate those problems. That's how I think about it.
The thing is, when it comes to like tire war, as I say, it's all about how a regulation is done, because we've said it about just in general the car regulations when it comes to aerodynamics. They're too restrict. Everyone seems to believe that they're too restrictive, and a tire war without regulation would be awful, and a tire war with too much regulation would be awful. Is the same way as it is with any other rule or any other division in that sort of thing, where, like, let's say, as I said, let's say we were to bring back, for example, let's say we were to avoid those things where people can't just make tires for qualifying. The softest compound is just for qualifying, and then the other 2 are for the race. Let's say if you qualify on a tire, like what we used to have back about 5-10 years ago, where you have to start on the tires you qualified on, or something like that. That could, or start. Obviously, we used to start on the fuel load that you qualified on, that sort of stuff. Whether bringing that sort of stuff would make it more entertaining or make it more entertaining, make it fairer, all that sort of stuff, would potentially help us out in terms of making a tire war actually work. Because that's the thing, if it doesn't work, then a tire war is boring, or it creates too much action in terms of, like, 2013. You don't want to see tires blowing up every 5 seconds, and also you don't want to see people making one stop right at the end like in 2010. That's the problem we've got here.
It would probably need to be done in tandem with something like refueling, because as an example, Monaco last year, that race would have been immeasurably better if we had in-race refueling, because even if the tyres were going to last forever, the fuel tank wouldn't, and they wouldn't have been able to get away with running the whole race, not doing anything. And it does need some regulation, because I'm someone who likes a lot of regulatory freedom and development freedom and flexibility in Formula One, but there would need, even if we had these tyre supplies and we had refueling back, there would still need to be a thing that you have to pit at least once and use more than one tyre compound in a race. And because of the refueling, it wouldn't then just be, oh, well, we do a one stop and they're going to have super durable tyres and we can just do it exactly the same time and it's fine. Is because if they build smaller fuel tanks, which they probably would, because in the long run it would be faster than having to start a race on 100 kilograms of fuel, and it gradually works its way down. And this was the case in the past, that you had teams like Arrows that had very small fuel tanks and did short stints. And then that has added benefits elsewhere of a smaller fuel tank in terms of weight distribution and ballast and the way everything is packaged in the rear of the car. It could bring a lot of freedom into it. I mean, people like to say, well, there's safety concerns because of cars catching fire and in the past in the pit lane. That's only happened because of some kind of weird system that's borderline cheating or just massive incompetency on the part of the driver or the pit crew that causes that.
Well, I'd also like to point out, nowadays NASCAR and IndyCar do refueling, and there's I don't know. I've watched IndyCar since 2023 and NASCAR since 2023. I haven't seen a pit lane fire in any of those things, because I think over there the series completely regulates it. So NASCAR and IndyCar, they regulate they say these are the fuel pumps you're using. This is the way you use it. If you use it any other way, you're getting fined £1 billion and you lose all your points. And that's how it should be, because safety things should be taken seriously. If a team was to, for example, make like a MP418 Frankenstein car that's going to kill its driver, they should be regulated into oblivion, because that's dangerous.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose even with fires, the Jos Verstappen one in '94, that's the only example of the car actually going up in a ball of flame like that. I mean, we've had, it was Brazil 2009. There was a trail of fire behind one of the Ferraris. Massa broke the hose off. Singapore 08. Albers did the same thing.
Fuji, when it was wet, so it just got extinguished.
Yes, Sato Fuji 07. Christian Albers, Magny Court 07 drove off with the fuel hose.
Keller at Brazil 2003 after the race. I'm not sure if that was fuel related.
I don't remember that one, but yeah. So these are, in the grand scheme of things, think about how many pit stops are done in a race and how many races there have been. Those kind of accidents are extremely rare, and also the closest anyone got to being injured in them was Verstappen getting his eyebrows singed a bit. Like, it doesn't. We haven't had someone die in the car from a fire like that. Well, of any kind since the 1970s. Yeah, and that was caused by an accident. It wasn't those are not pit lane calamities. Like, there's a way of doing it that is perfectly safe. And yes, like you say, they should regulate the fuel tanks and probably. So everyone is using the same device, and the fuel flow rate is the same, so you can't cheat and have really fast pit stops compared to everyone else. All that. Just basic stuff. But yeah, I just want the freedom in terms of the size of tanks and the tyres to give more variable strategies, rather than, because at the moment everyone does basically the same strategy in every race. You don't really get much, and even then it's only swapping the compounds around but it's the same basic concept.
Exactly, and I fully agree with all of that, because that's what F1 is about strategic variability more mixed with performance. And yeah, I mean, everybody does not only does everybody do the same strategy, everybody has the same tires. Like, I don't really understand why people think it wouldn't be more exciting with at least some more variability. I mean, if you ask me, everything should be up for discussion. There should be refueling, there should be wide open regulations, there should be a tire war. Every single weekend would be a step into the unknown, and it would be so much more exciting, because you just wouldn't have a clue who was going to be the best team. And that was something that we've lost in modern Formula One, because we know exactly how the tires are generally going to handle between the teams. And even if we don't, it's quickly made evident to us, and you can never really say one team is going to have some hidden advantage that the other teams don't nowadays. With refueling, it was also more exciting because you never knew when the first few drivers were going to pit. So the first few laps was always this perverse interest in who's going to pit first, and when someone pitted first, it would trigger chain reaction down the grid. But back to the tires, I think that it would solve a lot of the problems that people have been complaining about. Because if you're complaining about tires that last too long and don't provide any entertaining variability. Tire War would solve that with mandated compounds that have to be used and increased R&D in tire performance. If you're complaining about a tire not being able to be warmed up over one lap, which I see so many fans expressing their frustration that for the 10th weekend in a row, my driver could have been in Q3, but the Pirelli tires take 3 laps to get any heat into them, or they have to do two warm-up laps. That would be immediately remedied with a tire war. They'd be able to be switched on right away, and you could focus on the driving, not on the tire warm-up lap. If you're worried about even things like safety, I actually think a tire war obviously can make the tires more unsafe, but it also puts a lot of emphasis on not looking bad as a tire manufacturer. And people, the obvious thing people will say is, well, what happened in Indianapolis? Well, let me tell you something. That was not just because of Michelin pushing the envelope. There was some very strange data that was given to Michelin about Indy that weekend that wasn't exactly correct. We never had a situation like that at any other circuit. All the years we were in the tire war. So that weekend was a one-off that many people don't really know the full story of that weekend. It wasn't just that Michelin brought the wrong tires. They were also given information beforehand that was perhaps not correct. And they made a mistake. And you have to ask yourself if Bridgestone also did the right thing in not agreeing to a makeshift solution that everybody could have benefited from. So anyways, I really don't think we should be looking at that race and saying, oh, well, that happened, so we can't have it again. Bottom line is a tire war ticks a lot of the boxes that we're all complaining about in modern F1. And let me finish this part off by saying that the more suppliers we get in F1, I think the better it is for the sport as well. Why limit it to just 2 tire manufacturers? Why not have a 3-way tire war? I think that'd be thrilling and good for the sport on all levels.
I do tend to agree with those points. A 3-way tire war would be very interesting. Like, for example, if they were to have, obviously you got 4 big teams in Formula One right now: Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, and Mercedes. If you were to have, let's say, Red Bull on one tire, and McLaren on one tire, and Ferrari on one tire, and even Mercedes on their own tire, that could produce some interesting races. But there was 2 other points I wanted to mention. You briefly mentioned it: the cost cap. Obviously, this would probably come in conjunction with refueling and opening up the regulations. The only problem with that would be, let's say if some team does come up with some radical idea, they wouldn't be able to spend to see how good it is because of a modern cost. Obviously, you can now extend it and then you can do all that sort of stuff. But I think it would just end up being like what it is nowadays, where one team comes up with something amazing, every team copies it. I think that people will be less interested. And maybe you could argue that opening up the regulations would mean that people would have more ideas, and therefore, if an idea is guaranteed to be a second faster than everything else, they might develop it knowing it's going to be quicker. But that would be a problem. And also with Indy 05, yeah, there were a lot of things that went on because Bridgestone have Firestone, which is an American, the American contingent. I think they did some testing at Indy with Indy cars or some other, like with NASCARs and Indy cars, maybe not NASCAR, but with other open wheelers. So they knew exactly how the new diamond ground surface of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway worked. Whether Michelin were handed shady information or wrong information, or whether they just didn't have the information at all, is another matter. But also the fact that you said about makeshift options, Ferrari could have easily agreed to a makeshift chicane. Everyone starts the race and everyone finishes it without any issues. But it was only because Ferrari vetoed a makeshift chicane that race didn't go ahead with all 20 cars on the track. It was because Ferrari were being dickheads and essentially just being typical Ferrari, going all, we have a chance to win here, like 1960 Monza. They didn't boycott that race because they knew they were going to win it. That kind of stuff. And so, yeah, that race could have easily been solved a multitude of ways. A makeshift chicane. Maybe if Michelin had have just done more research. I don't think the same things would happen with modern day Zandvoort, for example, because I mean the Tarzan corner, the turn 3 at Zandvoort is nowhere near a sustained corner, and you could argue the last corner maybe so, but I think that given Indianapolis had happened, there would be precautions in place to make sure that safety stuff like that wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have what happened with F1, with Indy. We wouldn't have what happened, as I said, I keep mentioning it, NASCAR. NASCAR had a tyre war in the late 80s, early 90s between Hoosier and Goodyear, and Hoosier tyres ended up killing about 5 drivers because they were just trying to develop them too much and trying to make tyres that just couldn't do what they wanted them to do. I don't think that would happen because they're now more sensible nowadays. They have more safety consciousness and all that sort of stuff. I think that we wouldn't have any safety concerns. I just think we'd have competition concerns.
The bank corners at Zandvoort, I mean, they're far too slow for people to have blowouts on them. The thing is, also, Indianapolis, that would have been a fascinating first lap if they had put that temporary chicane in, because everyone would have done qualifying. They would have been approaching it having never used the chicane before.
They might have let them do a warm-up session or something like that.
They probably would, which would have ruined it, because otherwise they're all sat there trying to guess their... because the thing is, they would have to change the setups, because suddenly the high speed doesn't matter nearly as much.
Yeah.
And they would have all been guessing the breaking point for it and all of that. It would have been fascinating.
It just flies over everyone because he gets it wrong.
The thing is that probably could have, similar to Canada 2010 sparked this current, Pirelli revolution of high degradation and unpredictability. Maybe that would have sparked a revolution of having less practice time, because it's actually really interesting when the drivers don't know the entire circuit inside out and exactly how to put the camber and the toe angle and the spring rate and everything else.
That's why I've always said about having, because Formula 3 and Formula 2, I've always said this, they're supposed to nurture all this young talent to come through. They get 30 minutes of practice every weekend. That's pitiful. They get 30 minutes of practice, 30 minutes of qualifying, and then a race. Whereas F1 gets 6 times the amount of practice and how much, like, double the amount of qualifying, and they're supposed to be much better and more refined drivers. Just give them 30 minutes of qualifying. If your car setup shit, then you have a shit weekend and you did a bad job.
This is maybe I would raise it to an hour, but I think it's the same. You get one session on Friday, and if Friday's wet and the rest of the weekend's dry, or the other way around, well, tough shit. You're the best drivers in the world. I'm sure you can work it out. But also because most of the time it's circuits they've been to before, they can take the data from the previous year and they know roughly what setup to use. Because the thing across the weekend, there's hardly any. Most of the setups I've been kind of sort of predetermined almost before the weekend, because they have so much data and they just refine things a little bit rather than going into every weekend like with a neutral setup and not knowing what to do.
I'd also with that loosen park firmly. So for example, if it is wet qualifying and the rest of the weekend is dry, you can just change your setup to make it safe, because obviously a wet setup might even be unsafe in the dry, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because otherwise we end up with cars running from wet to dry, running high downforce at Monza, and it's just painfully slow for everybody.
Although that would make DRS racing more exciting.
Yeah.
So let me take a different stance on this, because you're not the only 2 people I've heard say this, that, oh yeah, let's reduce practice time and test the drivers. And if your setup is bad, too bad. I'm going to take a different stance to both of you on this and say, why are we limiting the driver's ability to customize their cars? Because it follow that the more comfortable they are with their cars, the harder they can race each other. The more confident they are to pull off a banzai move. The more confident they are to take cops flat out or something like that.
You could argue.
Why are we? You know what I mean? To me, the more comfortable you are with your car, the better the racing is.
You could argue that, but I also think it'd make it more on edge, because this is another criticism of just modern F1 in general. The cars are on rails, so someone doesn't, let's say, try and get their foot on the throttle on the exit of a corner and have a snap of oversteer. Like, you very rarely see that. You don't see people locking up and braking as much. You don't see people do. I think that a bad setup would allow for stuff like that. And yes, you don't want to just see people overtaking because everyone's making mistakes every other lap and it's just too much. But I sort of see where you're coming from. And like, someone would be able to, like a Kobayashi would be able to just send a kamikaze dive bomb at the inside of someone. And if Verstappen did that in a shit setup, would he then just cannon into the side of someone? Maybe. But I think that the benefits, and you could also argue that it would, because Formula 1 is the fastest sport on earth and all that sort of stuff, it would take away from the utmost performance by half a second a second. But I also believe that it would make it more entertaining, and the entertainment would come in a more raw fashion. It would take some fans back to the 80s and 90s, where you would see drivers locking up, you would see drivers spinning, you would see drivers have snaps of oversteer because the cars aren't on his rails. And if we do have, for example, the 2026 regulations supposed to make the cars lighter, supposed to make them more unpredictable, combined with that, coupled with that, we could be in for a good set of regulations where they aren't just glued to the circuit and you can't just stamp your foot on the throttle every single corner. That could be good.
Let me just bring you back though to the tire war eras. I actually think we saw more of those crazy crashes and huge mistakes in the tire war era at the same time, because people felt like they were invincible in their cars sometimes, and they would push to a limit that was way over the limit, and it's because they had the confidence to do that. When you don't have the confidence, a lot of drivers just drive within a margin, and that's when you get those boring one stop, everybody following each other races, and nobody has the confidence to really make a move around the outside or take a risk through a corner because the tires aren't heated up. There's a ton of understeer at the front, and because of the regulations now where the cars are basically like airplanes on wheels, nobody can pass. So it's an interesting one, Nedzo, because I actually think of it in a little bit of a different way. I actually think the more confident you are with your car, the harder you'll push it. And actually, even though the racing may be more exciting, the probability that you push over the limit goes up, right? I mean, think about the craziest crashes we've seen this century. It probably happened on a bone dry track in the tire war. And that's not just because it was earlier. I think it's just because, like, Alan McNish getting it wrong at 130R in Suzuka. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying, bear with me. Brazil 2003, traction control, tire war. We saw some of the most chaotic racing of all time. Take a look at Suzuka 2005. Take a look at races like, for example, Spa in 2004, where some of the tires lasted, some of them didn't. I actually think a tire war and more regulations being opened up would make it less predictable and actually also increase the chances of a mistake because everybody will feel like they can push to the limit and somebody will get it wrong.
And the hybrids, especially the Mercedes, they are just utterly faultless. And you can see in the onboards, particularly the 17 to 21 cars, the steering inputs are just completely accurate and there's no struggle of any kind. Whereas like even Jenson Button, who's one of the smoothest drivers we've had in those BARs, he's still having to adjust all the time and doing all of this kind of thing. So the cars in general, they were more unforgiving, but that's a lot to do with the technical stuff. When it comes to setup, though, it's like realistically, how long does it take to set a car up? Because a lot of the preliminary setup work is done before the race weekend has even begun because they have past data and because they have the simulators. And I feel like in tandem with having less practice time, I would allow unlimited in-season testing, but only at circuits not on the calendar. So even if you don't know the circuit better, you know the car better still, and you know its general characteristics. But also, everyone has that same hour, regardless of weather conditions and everything, to set it up. And it's like, unless one team has incompetent mechanics or engineers, everyone's going to get to an equal level of refinement. And maybe having the car not set up so well, it leaves more opportunity in the race to try and find the limit because you don't know where it is and you haven't reached it yet. And this has been an issue. Like Barcelona has often had this problem because it's used for testing as well, and it's been on the calendar for a very long time. Everyone knows that perfectly, and the races are very uneventful because the setups are all just exactly where they need to be, and they know when to pit and what the tires are going to do. Is that you need that? We need to find a way of making that sort of spontaneity and adaptability exist in dry conditions as well as wet. In that you don't always know, oh, this is exactly how it's going to go, and I'm going to do this. It's like, oh well. The tires are wearing out fast. Okay, let's try this and see if that works. Also, all of that kind of thing, rather than waiting for it to rain and what.
Peter, that's such a good point, and I just want to add that we've also become so sensitive in this era towards one little thing going wrong on a car or a tire. In the tire war era of this century, there were many races where there were just a ton of punctures. And what I'm trying to get at here is that didn't mean the tire was bad. It just meant that the teams were given free rein to push, and some of the drivers pushed too much, or a driver ran wide and got gravel on his tires and caused a puncture. That's part of the game. We've also become so trigger happy that, oh, there were some punctures in the race. We have to change this. Well, actually, that's part of the game. Everybody seems to think that no tire should ever have a puncture. It's down to the drivers and the teams to manage this. And then there's bad luck involved or good luck involved. And I think a tire war just adds to that because simultaneously, while allowing the drivers to push, there's going to be increased risk associated with these high performance tires. We can't be so caught up in Indy 2005 with that one race in Silverstone in 13, which, by the way, there was no tire war involved in 13, and I think a curb was causing those punctures. But we can't be so caught up in Indy 2005 to be put off by punctures. I would urge viewers to go watch the 2004 Belgian Grand Prix. I'm not saying that because a certain driver won that race and people know I support the driver. I'm saying that because go look at how many punctures there were in that race. So interesting to me that a good 6-7 cars had massive tire failures in that race. And nobody was calling for Michelin to leave after that, or Bridgestone to leave after that. So, Peter, what I'm trying to say is that kind of goes to your point in that that just makes things a little bit more unpredictable, and it gives us another element of unreliability and skill that the teams have to manage. You know, I don't want to be watching a sport where we know the tires are never going to have an issue. We know that the engines will never have an issue. We know everyone has the same strategy. We know everybody has the same fuel flow. We know everybody has the same kind of car design now with teams copying each other's cars. That's not what F1's about, is it? I actually think it just supports my earlier point. I just wanted to make that point about people being too sensitive also to things that happen with the tires. You're going to have punctures some ways. Deal with it. It's part of racing. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, punctures are a tricky one because most of them, if it's just, contact with another car or because you run over debris, that's unfortunate, but that's just part of racing. But when you get things like Baku 21, Stroll and Max both had very high speed, very dangerous crashes. With those, they weren't pushing the tires beyond their limits, or they weren't running excessively long stints. The tires just decided to explode at the fastest point on the circuit. And it's obviously there are safety implications, but then at the same time, if you start treating tires as just a part of the car rather than an addition, then you can say, oh, well, it's like when people have had crashes because the suspension has broken or a wing has broken off, that sometimes that happens. But at the same time, we change tires in every session several times, whereas suspension and other stuff is meant to last for several races, whereas tires don't do that. And it's just, it's a difficult one to balance on when it counts as being fair or if it's only happening to certain people and why.
I think that as long as high speed, like completely spontaneous delaminations are mitigated. So, like, we need to make sure that no one, for example, has a tire failure at the top of Eau Rouge because that could be deadly. We need to make sure that no one has, just in general, if someone has a tire failure in Saudi Arabia or in Jeddah and hits one of those concrete walls, they are gone. Like it would. That's just a fact. As long as we can mitigate those, and as long as there is rigorous testing, like there are to a scale factor of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that the tires are not going to fail at high speed, and that they'll fail. They can fail if they hit a curb, or if they do fail, it's going to be a slow puncture, and you're going to be able to see on all the data that, oh, his tire pressure has gone down 2. That means it's a puncture, and he's got to come in and he's got to make sure that tire is safe. That's fine. But if we, as I say, we can't have it where, like, yes, 7 or 6 punches in a race is good as long as there's a safety aspect to it. I don't want to see drivers having injuries. I don't want to see drivers having deaths. And I think we all don't want to see drivers having injuries or deaths just because of negligence or because of high-speed delaminations at places that shouldn't be happening. As long as we can guarantee that, I'm all for it.
It's interesting. After Spa 2004, so for context, 4 drivers had huge tire failures in that race, okay? This is in 2004. Jenson Button being one of them. He had a massive tire failure on the Kemmel Straight and went into the side of Zolt Baumgartner. People might remember that.
Yeah.
I watched the race not that long ago, actually. So yeah.
Toyota's third driver was Ryan Briscoe that weekend. He had a huge tire failure during the Friday practice. Coulthard and Montoya also had right rear punctures on Sunday. Very interesting to me that their teammates didn't, and that these were across different teams as well. So Button said, when we had 4 people suffering the same failures at 200 miles an hour, it can be very serious. You can't go racing like this, being unsure whether the tire is going to last or not. You don't crash at 200 miles an hour unless you have a failure. It's just so scary when it snaps away from you. And Michelin responded by saying they think that a curb at Spa was to blame. It reminds me so much of what happened at Silverstone in 2013, except F1 didn't have a hair trigger response. It stuck with it. And because there was a tire war, there was more resources put in to make sure that the tires were high performance while also being safer. But what I'm trying to say here is that this is part of the game. Like, that was a classic race. That was such a good race. Imagine if that race had no tire failures or no unpredictability, and after the first lap, we knew who was going to finish where. That's a great race to watch, again, for viewers to understand the risks associated with a tire war and how some of those drivers actually were just also thinking about that and managing their tires better than others. It brings in the ability to conserve and push a tire, not just one or the other. And it's a part of racing. Like, I really believe there will never be a time that if you want high performance cars, there won't be punctures at high speed. It's a part of the game. And as long as you make sure the curbs aren't causing it, you can control it. You can yourself as a driver mitigate that risk. And when you start cleaning up the sport to an extent where nobody has any issues with their car ever, that's when you get a very boring spec series product. And I pray people aren't so sensitive that they won't understand this. I really think that danger is a part of the sport. Of course, like Nedzo said, you don't want to see people get hurt, but it has to be there. You can't just take this away and pretend like it can never happen. Anyways.
I just think that there were some good points made there. I think that you mentioned about the curbs and you mentioned about how it's mainly, if it was definitely the case that Spa 2004 and Silverstone 2014 were all caused by curb failures, then tracks need to be held to the same scrutiny that tyres do. Because, I mean, I am in strong belief that the FIA have become very lax in terms of track safety in terms of in the past few years. We've seen Lusail 2021. Tires getting punctures because the curbs have got triangular sharp bits on them. Like who ticks that off and said that was a good idea? Jeddah, I still don't know how that track, apart from because of money, how that track was approved in 2021. Blind corners round super fast corners with concrete walls on either side. How that was approved, I will never know. Because I will say this: if we have these kind of out there tires, fuel, cars, these new 2026 cars, I believe that someone will die at the Jeddah Corniche circuit, and then only then will we start saying, actually, this is unacceptable. Why are we just accepting these countries' money just because they're rich, and we have to hold them up to the same standards that we do other countries? That Jeddah, the modern circuits have an obsession with making straights that aren't actually straight. Like Miami, the accident that happened between Gasly and Norris, the only thing that happened in that race at all, that accident would have been avoided if that straight was just normally straight, because Gasly just kind of understeered into what was kind of a racing line, but the racing line kind of changed and switched places because it was on one side of the straight, but it was on the other side of the straight because it's not a fully straight. I just believe that track safety in general needs to be amped up to an nth degree. They need to take to Saudi Arabia. I don't care if you want 27 corners on your circuit. You're having straights that are actually straight. You can knock out 2 or 3 of those corners just because. They need to tell to those countries, like, you can't just put concrete barriers on the exit of fast corners, because that's what killed Roland Ratzenberger, and that's what killed Ayrton Senna. And that's what has killed many drivers before, and that's what will continue to kill drivers in the future. I genuinely believe that someone is going to die at an FIA, maybe not in F1, maybe in F2, like an Antoine Hubert, maybe like a Delano Van at Hoff. Someone is going to die at a track like Jeddah, at a track maybe not like Miami, because having a straight that isn't straight isn't particularly heinous, and a crash at the start of a Miami straight wouldn't be deadly. But at somewhere like Jeddah, where it's super fast corners, super blind corners, super dangerous corners, it's going to happen at some point, and then they're going to go, oh, we didn't expect that. Well, you should have expected it, because it's going to happen.
It's weird, really, because the other 3 Middle Eastern circuits are all actually incredibly safe and are some of the safest on the calendar, except Jeddah. It kind of goes back to the old circuits of the 50s and 60s that had basically no straights, and it was just because they were built on roads, just lots of random wiggly bits and all of that. And,
There's always around a volcano, or it's got massive dips and shit.
Yeah, there's no real proper flow or logic to it. It's just whatever roads they can find and use.
Yes.
Yeah, I fully agree with all of that. The circuits need to be held up to standard, and certainly, I've always said, like, when it comes to the curbs and the tires, back to that point, there needs to be like a proper inspection that ensures that there's no issue with the curbs and the tires. It's always frustrating when a curb causes punctures, and it dilutes the conversation. We shouldn't be talking about like something on a track that causes the tire failures. I mean, I don't think that's safe at all because that's impossible to know or manage going into a race. It's it's something that I think the sport is trying to manage better, which is good. But curbs need to be made so that they're safe. And then when it comes to the straights and the way these modern circuits are made, I think you make a good point, Nedzo. I think some of them are strangely built. I don't know how Saudi Arabia's track got approved. I think money had something to do with it. But I'm not a fan of modern circuits. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm a backwards person, but I just can't stand any of these modern circuits.
I mean, that new circuit, isn't it in Medina? They're trying to going to build is it Medina or Mecca?
They're building a circuit in Medina.
Qiddiya. It's Qiddiya, that new one, and it looks like Yongam if it's been ruined by AI or something. Like, I don't know what to make of it.
What I will say about the curbs is, how we've got, as I say, fuel, if it was brought back, would be regulated, and it'd be the FIA deciding what the fuel looks like and how it's put in and all that sort of stuff. Tires, to a degree, are nowadays decided. It's all Pirelli. It's all decided by the FIA how soft they are and how much they degrade and all that sort of stuff. Why don't just do that with curbs? Say this is what the exact design has to be like. If you try and do anything else, your track doesn't get approved. That's why, like as I said, Qatar with their stupid triangular little things that just cut the tires up. Just to have it so that you have one set, like you can have a low curb, a high curb, you can have a wide curb, a short curb, that sort of stuff, and they're just set templates that they have to use. Otherwise, they just don't get approved. That sort things out.
So true, Nedzo. I think that needs to be taken into account. That's something that I think would just improve the racing and give us a clearer picture every weekend of where things stand. You don't want those kind of things affecting the outcome of a race. Just completely unrelated. Why on earth are these Middle Eastern countries so obsessed with hosting like 6 races, 3 races a year, whatever it is?
Money.
It's like
it's because the oil is running out, so they're trying to diversify their economies, basically.
Your economy, is it? Because
before they go back to being the desert folk,
The thing is that I'm not against it. I mean, I think that I'm glad that somebody's putting money in the sport. I think we should be appreciative of that. But when you look at the attendance figures, it's always the least in those circuits.
Yeah, because they're really expensive to go to as well.
Especially Abu Dhabi, they're trying to increase their tourism. That's what their tourism is basically the thing they're trying. That's why Saudi Arabia is doing an amazing project or insane project, maybe not amazing, like the line and all that sort of bollocks. That the reason why is just because of tourism. They're trying to diversify into tourism. That's why the UAE has the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world. That's why they have all these fantastic skyscrapers that Instagram influencers go and stand next to and say, "Look at me, I'm in Dubai." Piss off, no one cares. But regardless of that, that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to diversify it. And while the average F1 fan would rather, like, for example, an average British Formula 1 fan would rather go to Silverstone than Dubai, someone who's, for example, just wanting to go on holiday would say, "Oh, let's go to Abu Dhabi because not just because the F1's on, but because we can have a nice holiday in the sun, even though we might get our hands chopped off for just doing something that the regime doesn't like."
I'm amazed that Saudi Arabia would take a risk on their circuit like that, though, because if they really want a good image, they don't want a driver dying in Saudi Arabia at a dangerous track like that. It's interesting that they took such a risk. Maybe they wanted it to be like the best circuit on the calendar.
Yeah, but kind of.
I mean, they don't seem to. When it comes to image, they don't seem to mind executing gay people and apostates and all of that. So I mean, I don't think they really care if a driver dies at one of their tracks. Like that's the thing. They're also with tourism. People don't want to go there. But also, there are a lot of demographics that just don't feel comfortable being in those countries as well, and would just avoid it if they can. And we're seeing the same thing in football. A lot of people don't like the fact that loads of footballers are being bought out and coming over to Saudi and joining teams there instead of in Europe or America or whatever. They're just they're trying to buy everyone over, and it just feels so.
We're doing it boxing. We're doing it with golf, for fuck's sake.
It's doing it. It's all these results you see. It's such a perfect allegory of the man who built his house on the sand, in so many different ways in what's going on there,
right?
Because they have oil.
I think ultimately, a lot of truth to that. I think I'm not against people investing in the sport, but there should be investment that like we're all, and for their sake as well. They're going to put their money in. Like this money should be put in a way where it's like we're growing the sport and we're making the right decisions. you just wonder if Formula One isn't becoming too commercialized and just focusing on just mass marketing and media and
Well, that
social
boat's long
media.
sailed. It's already mass market, mass commercialized.
It's just way too much now. It's just like, yeah, let's throw a bunch of money. Let's go to some flashy place. Who cares about the race? Nobody's even, so many people don't even watch the Formula One races anymore. They don't even know what a tire war is or even care because it's like, oh yeah, I just follow F1 through the YouTube highlights, and then
Survive.
I just want my IG snap with Daddy Leclerc or whatever it is, and then I'm good, and it's like it's becoming about everything but the racing, and it's becoming about everything but merit and everything about money, and not just the Middle East, like it's like every region, like there's we're thinking about rotating Spa, like
Piss
Pirelli
off.
has this. Pirelli has no competition because F1 doesn't want to tinker with that because they don't want something that could add risk to the product. They just want to keep what they have and extract money out of it and make the fans put up with it. And the people that benefit are people who really the people who are benefiting are mostly North American fans who never even knew what Formula One was up to 4 or 5 years ago and now think it's the coolest thing in the world. And the rest of us who actually watch the sport have to put up with this like weird transformation that the sport's going through. And I'm gonna go full nostalgic old man here. I don't like where it's heading. I don't like a damn thing about Formula One these days. I'm frustrated with it. The tracks, no tire war, the cars, entitled drivers. We need to go back to the way it was. Okay, I'm sick of this. It's just like half of the posts are just social media posts or like someone holding a dog. Like it's just like it's just getting too much. Like this sport is about racing, right? This is about fundamentally science and technology marred with tremendous driving skill and unpredictability. When you start tinkering with that and you start resting on your laurels and just focusing on things that aren't to do with the racing, that's when you're going to alienate your old fans. And when the new fans are done with their fad, you'll be left with nothing. And I really don't like the direction it's headed in. I'm sorry, I had to get that off my chest.
That's all right, don't worry. But I mean, that's exactly your point of you alienate the old fans and then the new fans die out because it was just a fad. That is exactly what happened to NASCAR in the mid-2000s. And now they are completely reeling in their problems that they've had. Like the viewing figures for the 2006 Daytona 500 were what? 20 million. Now it's not. Now they can barely break into the 6 million, 7 million. They have a third of the fan base they once had. I believe that everyone should watch more motorsports. I believe that everyone should diversify their interests. No one should just be a Formula One fan, be a NASCAR ultra, be a IndyCar ultra. I mean, there's only 3 people who watch IndyCar anyway. But regardless, we should all watch F1, IndyCar, NASCAR, WEC, BTCC, Turismo Carretera. Who gives a fuck? Argentine Touring Car Championship. We should all be looking to do this, and it should all be about the racing product. And I'm grateful that Formula One is as big as it is now. Because if you'd have told the 8-year-old me who grew up in primary school with no one else following Formula One, I would have bitten your hand off to have people not just talk about Formula One, but say, oh, Lewis Hamilton did deserve a 2021 championship, even if they're just chatting bollocks and they're casual fans. I do like that modern Formula One is as big as it is now. There is some good with the evil. Also, there is some evil with the good, where you have more moronic Leclerc fangirls or moronic Arthur Leclerc fangirls who say he deserves to be in F1. Peter will know all about that. But it's a case of...
For the record, I do not think Arthur Leclerc is a Formula One caliber driver. I know that has nothing to do with your point. I just want to get that out there.
But literally nobody does. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. I believe that in its current state, Formula One is fine. I believe that we have... Yeah, the thing is, commercialization is going to happen. If you want a sport that is watched by even hundreds of thousands, millions of people, there is an element of commercialization. We can't all go to tracks that everyone knows. We have to go to a Middle Eastern race every year just to make sure that we balance the books, because they'll pay 800 million when every other track pays 2 million. I would say the perfect Formula One calendar still has 1 or 2 Middle Eastern races just because they are decent tracks. Bahrain is a decent track.
I agree.
It's just a case of how much is too far, because if we, let's say, because I've had people say that F1 is a primarily European sport, and it always has been. I believe that North America deserves some place. There are some very amazing American circuits that haven't ever been utilized by Formula One. Road America is an example of that.
It's always been the shit ones. There's been 11 circuits in America used in Formula One, and most of them have been garbage.
Sebring was, but it would never be used nowadays because it would shatter the cars to pieces because how bumpy it is. Riverside doesn't exist anymore. It's now a shopping mall. That was a good circuit before it got canned.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Sonoma.
Sonoma, the problem is with Sonoma, there isn't any long straight, so it wouldn't be good for F1, but it's good for Indy and it's good for NASCAR.
Yeah.
Watkins Glen, again, too short for modern day Formula One.
Too dangerous from the past. It was
Long Beach, if you extended it and made a super grand road course, it'd be amazing. But
the modern Long Beach sucks.
What is that?
Mosport in Canada, that's too small.
Yeah, it's too small. That's barely big enough for NASCAR.
Yeah.
Montreal, no. What's it called? Montreal. As I say, Montreal's a fantastic circuit.
Yeah, Caesar's Palace doesn't exist anymore. Phoenix was pretty boring. Detroit wasn't bad. It just, but it's,
it was just
it's
middling.
Detroit. Yeah.
I mean, I think the Detroit circuit was known to be terrible, wasn't it?
It was really tough.
The 1982 version was horrible because they had a hairpin that genuinely I can't like. When I go on Sims, when I go on Sims, I have to turn my wheel rotation all the way up, and it's just insane because it's tighter than the Monaco hairpin, and I don't know how that's possible, but it is. And the average speed there for the first year, I think the pole speed was like an average of like 80 miles an hour, and it was slower than Monaco. But I believe that again, if they extended that layout, it could work. Dallas, no,
that didn't work.
Indianapolis, Roval could work, but they just have to make it back to the 2004 layout and make it just.
They didn't need to change that layout, the infield.
And then what else we've got? Kota can stay. Kota's
good.
Yeah.
Miami, no thanks.
Vegas
go away,
now because it's produced 2 decent races.
Yeah, I guess it has.
Because it's cold. Because as I said, we talk about anomalies. We talk about anomalies. We talk about how the tracks and the races need to be unique. Vegas is cold as fuck. No one knows how to get the tires warmed up. No one knows how to make sure the cars are set up so they don't just either eat through the tires or just not warm them up. That's why I love, like, as much as there are flaws with NASCAR.
Again, the main issue with that one in the long run is attendance, because attendance is terrible because it's in the middle of the night, it's freezing cold, and it's stupidly expensive.
It's just like, what a disgusting event. And I'm gonna go out and say that, why are they putting up barriers so that fans can't even see the racetrack?
I agree with that.
Oh yeah, that. I mean, even the circuit itself on the cameras, you can't even tell it's Vegas. Like down the strip, you can just about see the casinos, but it's almost indistinguishable from Singapore. For the trackside cameras.
Yeah, this is why I love that. I keep banging on about it. I've mentioned about 8,000 times NASCAR, because we're like nowadays, like apart from Monza, apart from maybe Spa and the street circuits, every single Formula One circuit has no sense of uniqueness. Like they have the same characteristics, the same speed, the same medium speed corners, the same high speed corners, the same low speed corners. There hardly any of them have any actual uniqueness. Whereas you go to NASCAR, you have with the ovals, you have the short tracks, the intermediates, the super speedways. Darlington is completely different to every other track. Pocono is completely different to every other track, and there is a sense of uniqueness with the calendars over there that make it seem like you're actually watching a different product every weekend. Like you turn into Formula One and say, "Oh, what race is it this weekend? Oh, it's Zandvoort. Oh, yay. Oh, it's Spa. Yay. Oh, it's Suzuka." Like there isn't the same, "Oh my god, it's a Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. Oh my god, it's the Monaco Grand Prix at Monte Carlo. Oh my god, it's a British Grand Prix at Silverstone or Brands Hatch." There's no sense of, well, partly that's because there's 28 million races a year and the value is being completely taken out of it. But the tracks are just so watered down, diluted, boring because of, sometimes because of safety and it has to happen, but also because they're like the new tracks that have come in the last 30-40 years, they're just all so samey. That's because of Herman Walker. Like the only good tracks that really had some sense of uniqueness and produced decent racing, Korea, India, they've been binned because although there was a good track, there was no product and there was no
attendance is bad and mismanagement as well. I mean, the thing with Tilke, as well as not only has he built crap circuits, he's taken pre-existing circuits and made them worse as well.
They should have never. They took away Hockenheim's prime. Like again, unique. We're talking about unique circuits. Hockenheim was unique. Long straights, chicanes, fast bits. Don't know why they changed it.
I don't know why they did that.
It was
Even
a
like
local
watching.
government.
If we still had that, it would be like the only link we still have to the 50s and 60s to have that style of circuit. Because like Spa is nothing like it was, Silverstone's nothing like it was, Monaco is
The same
not
track, but it's not the same feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the cars are being crap. But another thing with NASCAR is that the drivers can get away with a lot more in terms of what they're allowed to do in races. And
Yes.
this has got nothing to do with tires, but obviously penalties for everything, and so many rules about how you can and can't overtake someone and where you're supposed to do it. Whereas if you watch like British touring cars at Brands Hatch, it's a bloodbath every time.
It's
You can just do whatever you want.
It's self-policing because if you ram someone off the road, they will do the exact same thing to you next time they come across you.
Yeah.
That's what people don't realize. What they need to do, I genuinely don't mind if they, let's say, make front wings out of steel or put bumpers on the cars just to make it so that you can rough people up a bit, or just make it so that they have to, like, because as I said, like we saw Spa, was it in 2023? Hamilton and Perez come together, and there's a tiny bit of damage on both of them, and they're like a second off the pace, and it's crap. They need to have it so that you can rough people up a little bit, even if it's just a little bit. I don't want to go into kind of, let's take someone out for the win just because I can win and they get the retirement. That's going a bit too far.
But that's going to happen. That's going to happen if you have something like that. Max Verstappen will definitely do that.
Gilles Villeneuve he ran a whole race with the front wing right in front of his face, didn't he? And because the cars are so well, obviously back then they didn't really need the wings, so he could keep going. But now it's like you take the tiniest little shard of carbon fiber off and you lose half a second.
Yeah,
or whatever.
They just need to. Yeah, I like. There are some things about NASCAR I don't like. I don't like how they basically made it so that they've too entertained-ified it. They've had overtime restarts where if there's an accident in the last 2 laps, they just start the field back up, and it's like they're going again. And the Daytona 500 is actually the Daytona 530 because they have 6 restarts. That kind of stuff pisses me off. But everything else, the idea of the sport, the feeling, the sentiment, everything that goes together to create the product is far better than what F1 has because it's just too diluted nowadays. They need to allow the drivers to show expression. Just because Mohammed Ben Sulayem comes from the UAE, where everyone's expected to toe the line of the authorities, doesn't mean that everyone else has to do that. It's ridiculous. He should be fired, and we should have a more sensible FIA president. I would rather Max Mosley or Jean-Marie Balest take control of the FIA in their current form, dead in the ground for 20 years.
Nedzo, my decision is the best decision.
My
decision is the best decision.
Surely we have elections coming. Surely we have elections coming up soon because I think he took over at the end of 21, didn't he? So if it's every 4 or 5 years, it should be coming up not far away.
Only the drivers. Democratic vote.
Yeah, that's the thing. Don't get me wrong. Jean-Marie Balest did have some dodgy moments. He did kind of favour Alain Prost at certain points, but he wouldn't do the things that Ben Sulayem does, saying, "If you speak out against me, you're banned." Essentially,
he actually brought in a law that bans criticism of him.
Yeah, again, I know that in the Middle East they have these dictator-esque leaders that are from the same family that all say you can't say anything about us, but it doesn't mean that they have to bring that into a globalized sport. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to quickly touch on. I don't disagree with any of that. What I'm trying to say here is that all this is going on, right? I mean, first of all, I just want 2 things then quickly. I need to gather my thoughts. I agree with so many things you said, Nedzo. I don't think NASCAR is properly run, and I think we only have to look at Formula One in the old days to look at the model when you had fans sitting on the grass banks, enjoying a race, character, freedom. There's no need to do what NASCAR is doing. NASCAR is run by very incompetent people right now, and I'll say that's my view. I'm not putting that view on either of you two. That's Tyron's view.
He doesn't know that the best thing about NASCAR.
It is run by completely incompetent people, and it's so nice to see because when I moved from Europe to North America as a child, everyone made fun of me for watching Formula One. And NASCAR was coming out with there were these movies coming out like Talladega Nights where Formula One drivers are being made fun of, and it was not nice, honestly. All this garbage. And I'm like, and it was so much pressure on me, like for some reason, like growing up in North America where people were like, Formula One is not cool, like you should be watching this and this. And now look at it.
Yeah.
I was right. Everyone who knows with a brain knows that Formula One is leagues ahead of NASCAR. There's never. What kind of rivalry is this? There's no rivalry. The other one's a joke compared to Formula One. So I don't even think we need to learn anything from NASCAR. I think it's a mess of a product, Nedzo. And you go watch those races. Look how dirty those drivers are, crashing into each other. You think that's the kind of racing we want here? We all know that's not what we want, yeah? We want Senna Mansell down the straight at Barcelona, Sparks, yeah? And Hakkinen passing Schumacher at Spa. You don't need contact for a great race. You need precision, skill, and bravery.
It's a cultural thing. This is my point again about Formula One being a European sport. NASCAR's a sport for rednecks.
Yeah.
The thing is, I do find it quite ironic though how you said we want clean, precise racing, and then you mentioned Ayrton Senna. That is kind of
it is ironic, and I agree. Senna crossed the line, and everybody knows who follows my channel. I am not the biggest fan of Senna. I respect his talent, but I've been on record. You both know this, saying that he was an entitled driver. He was super entitled. He took it too far. That's not why we're talking today. So I'm going to stop there and say that Pirelli is continuing.
I've heard that he had, what was it, more than 15 accidents in his career.
No. He crossed the line way too many times, and he's not my favorite driver, even if he's a genius.
Those
now. Nedzo, I just want to say one thing, and Peter too. So Pirelli's going to continue in F1 until 2027, and they have an option to extend. I don't think that F1 should extend their contract unless they agree to a tire war. I think the time has come where we've had, what is it now? Let's do the math. It's going to be 20 years in 2027 with no tire war. We are due a return to a competitive tire formula. We are due. We deserve it as fans. The sport deserves it. The teams deserve it. Don't give Pirelli a free pass. Make them compete against someone else, and you'll see the sport will get even more exciting. So I just wanted to alert everyone that the tender actually ends, or the contract ends in 2027. So it may not be too long before we see a new tire manufacturer or a tire war coming back into the sport. So food for thought there.
Yeah.
Something of a renaissance, almost, with the cars looking more like V10 cars, the 26 regs as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure our listeners will have a lot of their own opinions on
Everything we said.
yeah, everything we said, because we went quite off kilter as usual, but also on the notion of a tyre war and what needs to be done with the tyres. And feel free to let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.